Welcome to Books and Bridges, everyone. Thank you for joining us. We continue our discussion series on treasures of world literature. Tonight, we take a journey into the profound mind and prophetic conscience of the towering Russian writer Aleksandr Solzhenitsyn. In so doing, we will see the underappreciated Russian Orthodox character of his literary imagination. Books and Bridges is a public humanities institute of ideas and conversation. We explore the wisdoms of the world and apply them to modern life. We like to think of ourselves as offering a kind of third elevated space where we can step above our ideological and cultural entanglements and join people in the pursuit of something more beautiful and meaningful. I'm your host, Nathan Nielsen, and our guest is Dr. Ralph C. Wood. Dr. Wood has been a beloved and legendary professor of theology and literature at Baylor University for over 20 years. He earned his PhD from the University of Chicago and received a National Endowment for the Humanities Fellowship. Dr. Wood is the author of several books, including The Gospel According to Tolkien, Flannery O'Connor and the Christ-Haunted South, Chesterton, The Nightmare Goodness of God, and the author of a fine essay in this collection, Solzhenitsyn and American Culture, The Russian Soul in the West. So, I just want all of you to feel free to submit questions during our discussion, probably more so after our discussion. And Dr. Wood will be glad to answer your questions. And thank you for bearing with us again for our technical difficulties last night. I'm glad we could reconnect tonight. So Dr. Wood, I turn the time over to you and we will be all ears. Thank you for being here.
Well, thank you, Nathan. And I apologize, friends there. The fault was all mine. My computer was so messed up that I simply couldn't connect with you folks in trying to do so. And I do thank, of course, Nathan for this invitation. It's a wonderful thing to talk about Solzhenitsyn to anyone, to everyone. So I thought I would tell you how I came to have an interest in Solzhenitsyn and how I want to talk about the way in which his Christianity is often latent within his imaginative works, even more so than in the Gulag Archipelago. So I had read Solzhenitsyn, the Archipelago books. I was asked to review the first 2 volumes, and of course I was absorbed by this unparalleled witness against the horrors of the 20th century, the worst of any century prior. I'm never weary of saying, though it's a hard saying, more people were killed by violent means in the 20th century than in all preceding centuries combined. Roughly 180 million, that's a pretty modest estimate. At least 20 million of those in Russia itself. And of course, Solzhenitsyn is our witness against that horror, what St. John Paul II would come to call rightly the culture of death. So I had read the Archipelago books. I had read One Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich. I had read, of course, some of Solzhenitsyn's essays, the famous controversial Harvard Address, but I hadn't really gone much deeper into Solzhenitsyn than that when I got a phone call from my dear friend and former student, Jessica Hooton Wilson, who is one of the co-editors of this volume in which both Nathan and I have essays. And she said something really quite remarkable to me. She said, Nadia, Solzhenitsyn's widow, is disappointed that none of the essays address her husband's Christianity. Would you be willing to do so? Well, that was an open gate which I could not avoid passing through. Who would turn down an opportunity like that? Though I knew it would be quite difficult to do so, because Solzhenitsyn went through a period of when he called himself an atheist. He did not call himself a Christian until much later in life. And of course, his Christianity became more pronounced with the years. And during the years in Vermont, the whole Solzhenitsyn household was one that was radically oriented around the fasts and the feasts of the Orthodox Church. They had a small chapel, and when there was a priest in the area, he came and did the liturgy. And that devoutness continued right unto the end after he returned to Russia. And she wanted someone to treat that quality in her husband, ex-husband, her deceased husband's life and work. So I set about doing so. But I thought I would give a quick sketch of Solzhenitsyn's life in case there are those who have come to it fairly recently. He was a very, very bright young man, boy. At age 11, he led his class. He was at the very top. But he was being pummeled, of course, by communist propaganda, saying all things Western, all things Christian, all things Russian Orthodox were evil, and only communism could free not only the masses of adults, but young people as well. And so his comrades at the school jerked the cross off his neck. Every Orthodox youth is given a cross on a small chain that youth wears around his neck, her neck, I suppose, as long as they live. They jerked that cross off, threw it in the dirt, and Solzhenitsyn himself, alas, capitulated. He saw he had no future except by joining the communist youth movement. He did so. He remained there, very active. You probably know he became a distinguished soldier in World War II, but he made a very bad error. In what was meant to be something of a joke, he wrote a little manifesto, co-authored, saying that Stalin was no better than the worst feudal tyrants of the Middle Ages. And this, of course, got back to the authorities. And of course, he was thereby very quickly arrested. He was put in prison. And for 8 years, 1945 to 1963, Solzhenitsyn lived in the Gulag archipelago. Now, he was writing all the time there, recording these experiences. He knew that somebody had to tell this story, and that when he got out, he would try to do so himself. He was then sentenced to what was called internal exile in Kazakhstan, where he became a very successful teacher of high school mathematics. It was often said that Solzhenitsyn could have been a world-class mathematician had he turned his mind to it. But he knew that he had a calling greater than that. And so he found himself afflicted with what looked to be fatal cancer. The tumor kept growing and growing and growing to the point it was about to burst. They did not perform surgery on him. When, in a strange way, he underwent what is a quasi-miraculous recovery. And here's where things began to get very interesting. Solzhenitsyn began to see he had been given a new life, not of his own deserving whatsoever. Assuming that the communists had closed all of the Orthodox churches, he walked up and down in a small little city in Tashkent until he came upon an open church. He went into that church instantly. We don't know any more details than that he gave thanks to God. I suspect he might have even done the full Russian Orthodox prostration and thereby humbled himself before the God whom he had not ceased to believe, even though he had ceased to call himself a Christian. So you can see this becomes a harbinger of things to come. And he doesn't write in his archipelago books anything that is overtly Christian. And indeed, even in his best imaginative work, he doesn't either. However, I want to make the argument, and I want to get your response, that in the world of things that matter ultimately, what counts finally, indestructibly, is what is called ontological reality. Comes from the Greek word ontos, meaning being. And there are things, therefore, that are so deeply ingrained in the cosmos itself, in the whole of the cosmos, and even more so in the hearts of human beings, something that is fundamentally indestructible. And what I want to argue tonight is that that indestructible Russian Orthodox faith that he grew up in was latent, deep in the subconscious of Solzhenitsyn, especially when he came to write literary works of art. This means that the icon he looked up at every night as he was falling asleep, something was implanted in Solzhenitsyn's mind that would never leave. And it crops up most distinctively, I argue, in Matryona's home, on the one hand, and then, though less distinctively, still there in One Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich. But before doing that, I need to explain something extremely important about that kind of Russian Orthodoxy that never left Solzhenitsyn's consciousness. And that is that it's quite different from anything we have in the West. You know, very often people simply assume that Orthodoxy is the Eastern equivalent of Roman Catholicism. I was brought up short by one of my main tutors in things Orthodox, the late, great Father Thomas Hopko. If you want to learn more about Orthodoxy, simply Google his name. His work is all available in recordings, most of them free. He is a deep, deep Christian, maybe the deepest Christian I've ever met. But he really brought me up short when one day he said to me, now you need to understand that you Protestants, which I'm one, and those Catholics, which I'm not, stand much closer to each other than either of you does to us, Orthodox. Now, that's a stark, drastic statement, that there's something so unlike what we do in the West at work in Orthodoxy that you've got to understand a whole new way of conceiving the Christian faith in Orthodox fashion. Now, I've had a lot of help here. I've read, Florovsky, I've read Schmemann, the great Orthodox thinkers for the last several years, because I use them mainly in teaching Dostoevsky. I've taught him every year of my career that began in 1971, long before most of you were born. I had a first-rate course in Dostoevsky by one of the most eminent Dostoevsky scholars, Edward Wasiolik at the University of Chicago. Now, here are some of the things I've learned that will be extremely helpful for our understanding what goes on in Orthodoxy and what was therefore implanted inexpugnably in Solzhenitsyn's own consciousness. The first is they take great care to tend to the opening lines of the book of Genesis, which, as you know, declares, let us make man in our image and likeness. Well, all of my Hebrew scholar friends here at Baylor and elsewhere said, that's just a Hebrew doublet. There's no difference between image and likeness. They're the same thing. Not for the Orthodox. Here lies the big distinction. For the Orthodox, every human being is made in the divine image. It's indestructible virtually, though not completely indestructible. In fact, Gregory of Nyssa says when that image is destroyed, we become demons. Athanasius says when that image is destroyed, we become animals. But for the great majority of people, that image is there, always there. The great question is, what shall we do with our likeness to that image? Will we make our likeness to that image, which of course is the image of Jesus Christ, God's own Son? Or shall we make our likeness ever lesser to that image, so that we're contradicting it at nearly every point, or whether we are conforming ourselves to it at nearly every point? And one place to see that at work that Solzhenitsyn would have looked up at long after he left his Christian faith was looking at any Russian church, for that matter, any church in the Byzantine tradition, where the cross atop the church has a bar in the middle. There's the bottom bar, of course, where Christ's feet would have rested. You have the crossing of the arms, but between the place where Christ's feet would have rested and the very bottom of the cross, there is a slanted bar. And on Christ's right, it is slanted upwards as a reminder of the good thief who said, "Thou art the Son of the living God," and to whom Christ replied, "This day you shall be with me in paradise." But alas, on the other side, on Christ's left, that bar slants downward, because it represents, of course, the evil thief, the one who wanted to join with the crowd and said, "Release unto us Barabbas." And therefore, every person is all the time, often on a very jagged, uneven pace and level, becoming ever more like or ever more unlike the Christ in whose image we are made. That means then a second radically different thing in Orthodoxy that we don't get anywhere in the West. And that is a denial of the doctrine of original sin. Every Orthodox Catholic and Protestant believes in the doctrine of original sin, which is to say that we are not born innocently, we are born guiltily. We come into the world bearing Adam's sin, the Adamic curse, so that our nature is therefore under radical limits. It must be totally transformed from crown to ground, and its model is often the law court. That's why the central doctrine for both Catholics and Protestants is justification. That's a legal term, of course. For the Orthodox East, there is no such doctrine of original sin. We do not come into the world already guilty. They speak, therefore, of what they call ancestral sin, by which they mean that, of course, after we come into the world, we learn very quickly by watching what's going on around us, how to join the rest of the race by becoming sinful. But that sinful condition is not a matter of a curse, it is a matter of our own freedom to become radically more or radically less than the image in which we're made. Now, that means it's often a very crooked line runs right through the human heart, as Solzhenitsyn very famously said. I might read a passage from our book. This is, of course, one which everybody virtually knows, but if you don't, it's one that you might want to put on the lintels of your doorpost, so to speak. It may be the best passage in all of Solzhenitsyn. So let me turn to it if I might. If I can find it right here. Excuse me just a minute. Yes, here it is. This is from the Gulag Archipelago. Gradually, it was disclosed to me that the line separating good and evil passes not through states, nor between classes, nor between political parties either, but right through every human heart and through all human hearts. This line shifts. Inside, it oscillates with the years. That's a prophetic line. And even within hearts overwhelmed by evil, one small bridgehead of good is retained. And even in the best of all hearts, there remains an unuprooted small corner of evil. Now, that's realism of a very, very high sort, where Solzhenitsyn, on the one hand, can be very tolerant of evil because even in the most evil, there's a slight corner of freedom yet. But he can also be really scorching against the righteous because in all of our self-righteousness, there's a hidden corner of evil that can still undo it. So, thirdly, then, firstly, the image likeness distinction. Secondly, the distinction between original guilt-making sin and what they call ancestral sin, whereby we become sinful by our own freedom.
Hey, Dr. Wood, can I ask
Yes,
a question from Terry
please.
Mattingly about this very topic? He asks, we are born into a fallen creation, a world that is both glorious and fallen?
Yes, that's why, because the creation we're born into is fallen. However, that doesn't put us under any kind of curse. That means that we are not so completely at a loss in our human nature that we can do nothing about it until we are completely justified from beyond ourselves by, of course, Christ's atoning death upon the cross. Now, the East doesn't reject the doctrine of atonement, but it rejects the Western conception of atonement as fundamentally substitutionary, where Christ puts himself in our stead. The East has a much more imitative understanding of the cross. Christ is the one who enables us to make our likeness conform to our image. And when the two become completely one, that is what's called, of course, sainthood, perfection. After all, our Lord said, be perfect, even as I am perfect. My Father in heaven is perfect. Let me just illustrate that point quickly by way of the icons. Every icon has not a halo, important distinction. A halo appears in Western Christian art as something that crowns the head of the saint. In Eastern iconography, it's not a halo, but a nimbus, another word, of course, for cloud, because out of the saint's head is bursting pure light. And that light, therefore, represents true sainthood, complete perfection. And therefore, all the icons of the saints are filled or are characterized by that nimbus. Does Terry want to come back and give me, as a fellow Baylorite, a refutation of my reading? He's a convert, by the way.
I think he agrees. I do have a question, though, about the difference between image and likeness.
Yeah.
Is image more nature-oriented and likeness is more action-oriented?
That's pretty good. The image is in our being. It's who we are. And therefore, it is well nigh unto indestructible. But that's why actions are so crucial in the Eastern Church. I remember saying to Thomas Hopko what happened when Robert Bridges wrote his dear friend Gerard Manley Hopkins and said, what must I do to be a Christian? Bridges, though, of course, famous as poet laureate, couldn't bring himself to believe. And Hopko really liked the reply given by Gerard Hopkins. He said to Bridges, give alms. Do something. And that could be well called an Eastern motto. Yes, action is crucial. It's not simply the inward interiority of the person that matters. It's the way in which our whole being is transformed so that the inner nature and the outer action become one. That's who we are. As they become either more one or less like the other.
And the outcome is in the balance.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. Now, that's a complicated matter, which you shouldn't probably get into, but there is the doctrine of hell is very strong in the East. The presence of demons is very strong in these. Read the Brothers Karamazov if you have any doubts about that. Because Ivan has a visit from the devil. Now, in many ways, it's comic, but it's clear that this is not a joke. This is not a joke. Whereas that is not a predominant motif in a good deal of Western literature, the presence of the demonic. And of course, he writes a whole book called Demons. It used to be called rather mildly, The Possessed. And the Pevier Volonkonsky couple, they're Orthodox, by the way, who've translated all of Dostoevsky, all of Tolstoy, and now they're doing, I think, Chekhov, make it very clear. They renamed that book Demons, not The Possessed, but Demons, which apparently also fits the Russian better. So yeah, now whether the hell is a state that cannot be in some sense turned is another question. And that would take us far afield from Solzhenitsyn.
Well, thank you. Yeah, feel free to continue. Thanks for answering those questions.
Good.
If I have more questions from the viewers, I'll let you know.
Okay, please do. Well, my third point is from the first two, and that is for the Eastern Orthodox Christian, the doctrine of theosis, Theosis, is absolutely central. It can be translated into English as divinization. Charles Williams, the sometime very witty Inkling, says what it means is we're meant to be in-godded. Because there's a passage in, I think it's First Peter, where the author says, you shall become gods. And Athanasius, of course, puts it at the very core of his little book on the incarnation. God became human that we might become God. Now, God within our own limits, within our own mortal nature, and with the perfection that can be attained in the way I've tried to describe. But that means that every person is already a little God. C.S. Lewis, by the way, bought this notion down the line. If you know, for example, The Great Divorce, he argues that very case. And he was a member, by the way, of the Oxford Orthodox Society. He was deeply sympathetic to the East. Now, this idea of divinization doesn't mean becoming goody two-shoes. It's not a scheme of moral improvement. It's not making a list and checking it twice. It is not Ben Franklin's. You remember his famous 13-point program of perfection, where 1 week he would spend on each of the virtues until he achieved them all in 13 weeks. And in the 13th week, he would achieve this one, imitate Jesus and Socrates. So you learn that in a week and you become perfect. No, 1,000 times no. In the East, you don't have these schemes of self-improvement, but the phrase that I like best of all is this one, which all of our Orthodox friends will hear and understand. By death, he has trampled down death, giving life to those in the tombs. Now, the tombs doesn't mean they're simply those who have died and who will be bodily resurrected, but it means all of us now living in tombs, which is to say, living in death. Because I've learned from one of Terry Mattingly's very good friends, Father Stephen Freeman, right there in Oak Ridge, Tennessee, that death is not our natural enemy. It is our unnatural enemy. So that most of the sins we commit are in an attempt to fend off that unnatural thing of death. The demonic is what takes the form of this unnatural death. So think about all of our wars, think about all of our schemes for violence, think about all sickness, all political conflict. They are attempts to fend off this horrific, unnatural thing, death. And of course, ours is now becoming, with the COVID crisis, death haunted by that unnatural thing that the East, I think, understands us better than we do in the West. So that in the Orthodox East, you have then these three distinctive qualities, as I understand them, and that this means that we're all on our way to becoming gods or animals or demons, or those who shall dwell in hell, unless God rescues us from that. Now, I will segue to the two works of art that I'd like for us to talk about, unless there are questions.
No questions. Actually, we do have a question from Brian Avery. He asks this: if orthodoxy is so central to Solzhenitsyn's worldview, why doesn't creedal Christianity figure more prominently in Solzhenitsyn's post-exilic writing? He seems to speak of a religious faith more naturalistic than specifically creedal.
Yes, that's exactly right. I think there are two reasons for that. One is he was himself very slow to recover thoroughgoing liturgical creedal orthodoxy. It came really pretty much during his exile. Secondly, he wanted to reach the largest possible audience. And of course he has, but by speaking in what I would call generic religious terms, as the questioner has noticed, became one way to do that. In other words, if he had put up a big sign, hey, remember, I'm an Orthodox Christian, over the Archipelago books and others, they would not have had the effect they have. Now, having said that, what I would like to do then, in the latter part of our time together, is to show how these basic assumptions that I've tried to lay out here are at work in the depths of Solzhenitsyn's subconscious, that they, as it were, bubble up from the very bottom, so as to transform his imagination in ways that are orthodox without having been previously well noted. In fact, not noted at all. I think they appear in both Matryona's Home and the One Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich, more in the former than in the latter. If you know the story, and by the way, these were the two books that were most thoroughly edited. My friend Jessica Hooten Wilson likes to say, no wonder that there are his real literary masterpieces, because he had to submit to editors who really wouldn't let him get by with shortcuts. He had to perfect them. Well, once you win the Nobel Prize, nobody's going to say, hey, I need to edit your work, Solzhenitsyn. And some of it apparently is pretty bad. I mean, the Russian can apparently get very sloppy. I don't have Russian, I don't read Russian, I can't make that judgment. But I know that from friends who do read Russian, that it may be sometimes, instead of Solzhenitsyn, what Nabokov said of Dostoevsky. Nabokov also thought that Dostoevsky was a very sloppy writer, not a real master, of either the craft of the novel nor of the Russian language itself. And therefore, he got off one of the most scorching lines ever uttered. I hope they don't apply to Solzhenitsyn, but they may. That is, he said, Dostoevsky is the only writer in the history of world literature who improves with translation. The translation of all of his books in English are really very eloquent. I can attest to, however, whether they are adequate translations of the original Russian or not. So here we go with Matryona's home. It's the story of a woman who is a kind of almost a ne'er-do-well. And apparently it's very much like the woman with whom Solzhenitsyn himself rented a room during his time of teaching there in the small village. She doesn't keep the house very clean. She's not worried about cleanliness. He says sometimes the narrator, Ignatich, says sometimes I could see cockroach legs floating in the soup. There's a mangy cat. There is a goat that she keeps, but just barely. She has to steal hay for that goat. But she never complains. She never whines. She never says what a terrible lot she has suffered. So that when she gets ill, we're not told what her illness is. It becomes almost fatal. And she is therefore laid off the communist farm on which she was working, so that the small income she had derived from working on that communist farm is no longer available. The commissar's wife comes and brazenly enters the home without permission to make sure that Matryona is not lying about her inability to work. And yet she takes no umbrage. She never complains. She is accommodating unto the extreme. We don't see any overt practice of her orthodoxy, though there are apparently some icons on the wall. And she submits to a gradual ruin of her life. She has built an extra apartment. By the way, she had no one to help her raise her children. Her husband forsook her. She's lived a bad life. But as I say, once more, without bitterness or complaint. So she had this extra room built on to her ramshackle house. And her very brother decides that he needs the lumber, the timber from that room, because the local communist authorities have declared that unless he expands the size of his own house, he will not be allowed to keep it. And so she says, in effect, come and get it. And she even assists them as they're taking off the lumber, the timber, from her own unused apartment, even though it's been to her a representation of what her life could have been. She even helps load the timber onto the sledge that's taken down, where it's to be carried across the railroad track to her brother's home. And again, having no apparent bitterness, she follows that very wagon down to the railroad. Unfortunately, the wagon gets stuck on the railroad track. Can't pass over it. Instead, a train crashes into it and sends it into splinters. And there, Matryona herself, not watching carefully two trains backing one into the other so as to be relinked after the crash, is herself crushed. And so it appears that she is a noble, deep, peasant Russian soul who exhibits the very qualities most revered. So let me, if I might, read the last things that are said about her. These are words, of course, that the narrator gives. For Matryona, it was the end of everything. Hence, Ignatich's melancholy conclusion to the entire novel, or entire narrative. This is how the short story ends. We had all lived side by side with her and never understood that she was that righteous one without whom, as the proverb says, no village can stand. And then two more remarkable standalone sentences: nor any city, nor our whole land. The word Matryona is a derivative from the Russian word mater, mother. And so the story has been interpreted widely to be Solzhenitsyn's tribute to a woman much to be admired, who was simply a victim of these huge historical circumstances that swept over Russia by communist power. And she was chewed up in the awful Moloch of that system, and yet she still held to the end a kind of faith, a kind of righteousness that justified a whole city, a whole land, like few others. However, I got to looking at that scene, and what I discovered is that two only parts of Matryona's body are not mangled: her face and her right hand. So she's crushed from the waist down, chest down, except for the right hand and the face. Every night, Solzhenitsyn looked up at an icon that would have shown him what a holy face really looks like. For in the Eastern tradition, the face is the essence of one's being. There's a terrifying saying from Gogol that I quote. Gogol says, when souls degenerate, faces also break down. Hers has not broken down. It has not degenerated. It has retained all of its kind of innocent Orthodox purity. And with her right hand, if she is indeed bodily resurrected, she will still be able to make the sign of the cross. Because, as you know, the Russians sign from right to left, not left to right, as we do in the West. And so there is about her more than just a noble peasant woman who makes the world keep from crashing upon itself. There's a quality of a kind of hidden orthodoxy in her that Solzhenitsyn brings out almost inadvertently, because he then describes her funeral in terms that are exceedingly interesting, because what happens at her wake is everybody gets drunk, and they make a parody of the holy event of the blessing and burial of the dead. So let me read just a passage from the story. At last the supper was over. This is the wake of the dinner. They all rose again from the table. They sang, "Worthy is she." That's a passage from the Orthodox liturgy for the burial of the dead. Then again, with a triple repetition of eternal remembrance. Now that is one of the most holy moments of any Russian Orthodox funeral, I've heard it uttered, and it sends shivers down your back when the priest says, eternal memory, eternal memory, eternal memory. For what it means, of course, if you're remembered by God, you dwell forever. You're not crushed in the Moloch of Russian communism merely. So what I try to make this out to be is Solzhenitsyn's maybe unwitting, but nonetheless real tribute to the depth of Matryona's life and witness and person, where her likeness becomes one with her image, and not simply a sad. It's sad, of course, because you see in this word ontological, see, things that are ontologically real don't go out of existence even when someone parodies them. So they're making that hoarse or out of tune repetition of eternal remembrance as mockery, but that doesn't keep it from being real. And likewise, worthy is she, they say in mockery. That doesn't mean it's fake. So I'm eager to see when the book is reviewed what critics make of this, my interpretation of it. And some of you might want to have one. Let me read just finally, and I'll let you come in, a phrase from Florensky, great Russian theologian. The fruitfulness of memory is victory over death. Not at all because we erase the dead in our mind's oblivion. That's what secular culture calls getting over it. But precisely because we keep them so strongly, so brightly present in our love. And of course, you pray daily for the dead. By holding another in our love, we are becoming like God. In this way, the other becomes to become our very self. What begins in isolative grief concludes in relational joy. I think that's what's going on at the end of Matryona's home, but I'm sure there are readers there who would like to cross-examine me about that. I might say, well, I shouldn't say that. I hope that Nadia Solzhenitsyn is pleased with those readings, and I'm sure my friend Jessica Hooten Wilson can get me in contact with Mrs. Solzhenitsyn and see what she thinks.
That would be great. Well, thank you, Dr. Wood. I just have a question before I go into some of these other questions. Sure. What do you think what does it say about the versatility of a writer who can, on the one hand, dismantle and expose a brutal empire in the Gulag, and then on the other hand, write such a sensitive, touching, personal portrait of a God-fearing, humble woman like Matryona? Yeah, that's versatility.
It is, absolutely, and I might say it is an imaginative gift. Solzhenitsyn, in writing the Gulag books, is simply recording. He is letting his pen fly so fast that he's not so much trying to re-image those events as to record them. Literature doesn't record. Literature imaginatively creates. And I think that's what he was doing when he wrote that story. That was, again, as I've learned, polished. It had to go through editors. And things came forth that may not have been his intention. But the more I read that story, the less it seems like just a kind of sad tribute to a noble peasant woman.
So we have a question from our friend Christian Van Gorder. He asks, here is a quote and a question. Quote, the simple step of a courageous individual is not to take part in the lie. One word of truth outweighs the world. It's a powerful statement. And then the question is, why is truth-telling and honesty elevated as the mark of a courageous individual? And what does this say about our present social and spiritual context?
Good. The first quote becomes the very basis of my friend Rod Dreher's new book. If you don't know that book, I encourage you to get it, read it. It's a very powerful book, whose title is Live Not by Lies. And he takes that very quote from my colleague and dear friend, Chris Van Gorder, as the basis for his whole book. What that means then is that the three great indestructible ontological realities, truth, beauty, and goodness, cannot be destroyed, and that the marring of things beautiful into things horrendous creates, as it were, a very hole, gap, cavern, cave in human existence itself as we go down the drain of ugliness. Now, ugliness doesn't have to be defined as being not pretty. I mean, I tell my students Mother Teresa's face is arguably the ugliest face in the history of Christendom, and it's absolutely beautiful. Likewise with goodness, it's there. It's built into the cosmos. It's a transcendental. It's ontologically real, and therefore it brings upon us an horrific judgment when we are anything less than good. And of course, good is defined by God. Goodness doesn't define God. God defines goodness, just as beauty is not defined by us, but God. And so, above all, with Chris's question about truth, ours is not a truth-telling time. It's not just COVID-19 that should make us tremble. I don't need to be too specific here, but it's not hard to think of the absolutely fearful lies that we are being told and have been told in recent years. And I might say, lest one thinks too obviously of the example that will come up, this is as much on the left as on the right. Tremendous lies, untruths being told about the human body, for example, where it could be simply a site of surgery, where perfectly healthy organs are cut away. And one could name many other examples of that kind of massive poisoning of the truth in our culture. In fact, I tell my students, I tremble when I go into the classroom because I know I can do more damage here with my teaching of these great books than I could do ever with my fist, with a club, with a gun, with a machine gun, with an airplane, because I can ruin human minds, the minds of my students. I can poison unless I tell them the truth as God has best given me to understand and to articulate it. So truth telling by our ministers, truth telling by our leaders, truth telling all around is the measure of a society. And ours is a society of untruth.
So we have a comment and a question from Father Stephen Freeman.
Good.
He says, it is held in Orthodox tradition that the world continues in existence through the prayers of a small number of the righteous. And he asks, would you describe Matryona as a holy fool? Here he's thinking of Laris or Lavr by the Russian novelist Yevgeny Vodolazkin.
Yeah. Well, I agree with my good dear friend, Father Stephen Freeman, that the prayers of a few hold the whole cosmos, certainly the whole earth, away from the brink of destruction, because we don't think as Christians in quantitative terms. We think, as I've tried to say tonight, in ontological terms. That's why I love teaching Flannery O'Connor. Her characters all come to their redemption, often in the blink of an eye. But a blink of an eye that sees and understands and grasps the truth is worth 1,000,000,000,000 years of untruth, because you're not combating two equals. I agree with him, therefore, thoroughly. And that's why we need more intercessory prayer from people that are few in number, but are not worried about their fewness, but are keeping to their faithfulness.
Terry Mattingly has one comment, and then there's a question from Josiah Neely. Terry says, at the end of every March for Life, the Orthodox gather with several bishops in front of the Supreme Court and sing Eternal Memory.
Oh, my.
I didn't know that.
I did not know that. That's wonderful, Terry. Thank you.
It's a moment that always stuns me.
Yep.
Josiah Neely asks, is there a religious significance to Matryona marrying the brother of her first love, Yefim?
Yeah.
She marries Yefim, and she wanted to marry Fadye.
Yeah.
In the story.
I don't know. I would plead ignorance on that. I suspect there is, and I would be glad for our friend to drop me a note and tell me what that significance is. It could lie, of course, in the biblical injunction about if one's brother dies and a widow is left, she is to be married to, as I remember, the brother who had died, who was still living, the brother of the dead. But let's leave that lie. I need to fresh up my memory of Scripture better than that.
So let me ask you one question before we start wrapping up. You know, there has been a question tonight, and I think several people ask this question when they think of Solzhenitsyn's writing, his religiosity. It seems to me that though deep down he's a very spiritually grounded, intense individual, that he's not one to wear his religion on his sleeve, so to speak, and that he depicts Matryona as very similarly, as someone who is moved and animated by religious principles, but does not outwardly show them off. Do you think he lived that way himself?
That's right. Now, that was not true of his years of exile. I mean, Joseph Pierce and others have recorded. Pierce went and visited the Solzhenitsyn at their home. I think Dan Mahoney did as well. That these people prayed for the salvation of Russia every day. That was a crucial prayer that they uttered. That they observed all. And by the way, this is very interesting in our season. Easter was always the much greater event for the Solzhenitsyns than Christmas, because ours is an Easter faith. The birth of our Lord, his nativity, is indeed a holy feast. It is not comparable to the feast of Easter. And I really do, when I show my students the icons of the resurrection in the Eastern tradition, they are stunned by it, because it's very hard to depict a resurrected Christ. Grunewald tried, and if I may say so, he failed. But in the Russian tradition, what happens is that Christ burst out of hell on Easter morning, pulling with him all of the saints who've lived with a kind of anticipatory faith and who therefore are to be brought into the kingdom. And he pulls them by the wrist. My Orthodox friends have pointed out. I mean, he never grabs them by the hand. If you grab someone by the hand, you can jerk them. If you hold them gently by the wrist, you lead them. So the Russian understanding of God is never a bully. And that's why you can wear your faith, Nathan, I think, lightly and still be thoroughly Orthodox.
Yeah. Thanks. One more question from Betsy Vandenberg, a longtime Books and Bridges supporter. She says, I'm moved by your comments on truth-telling. You earlier referred to the great truth of the line between good and evil cutting through every human heart. This age of identity politics, racial division, and the attendant belief that certain races now being categorized as virtuous and others as oppressors and evil, it seems the opposite of the human heart idea. Your thoughts? Identity politics versus universal soul.
Yeah, I do. I think when Solzhenitsyn made that now lapidary statement, he was still thinking about primarily responsibility of individuals, and that every human heart, and he says it oscillates, remember, it oscillates back and forth. It's not one straight line. But he became immensely disillusioned with the West after living here. When he saw, as he put it, we had forgotten God. And so I think I could put this matter best by giving you an aphorism from Solzhenitsyn. He said, the communists paid Christianity the ultimate compliment of trying to kill it and failed. The West has paid Christianity the ultimate insult by trying to domesticate it and have succeeded. Now that's hard, and that's true, I think.
Well, thank you very much. Do you have any other last comments before we close?
I'd like for those words of Solzhenitsyn himself to be my last comment. They are, when I first heard him say that, or saw the recordings of his saying that, and I was just taken aback. He's exactly right. They tried to kill us and they failed, but that was a compliment. I mean, I will say this: the communists saw that the chief enemy was not political, it was not military, it was not commercial, it was spiritual. And that if they didn't kill the Christians, if they didn't put them out of business one way or the other, they would never succeed. And of course, as many have pointed out, more people were killed in communist Russia than under the horrible reign of Diocletian and others in the early centuries of the church. I mean, these persecutions outdo any previous Christian persecution. And therein lies, of course, this very deep latent strength of orthodoxy. They couldn't kill us. How do we live so that we might bring others to life?
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Wood, for illuminating this impressive, towering literary life of Aleksandr Solzhenitsyn. The power of the pen is truly, in the Russian tradition, the power of the pen can be like a second government. So thank you very much.